Hello friends, my name is Shani Goyani and we'll learn about ecology today. So, we all know about ecology, the system that we live in. Okay, it contains certain components. As you will look around yourself, so you will see there will be various kind of components. You will see trees, you will see soil, you will see different kind of animals, insects, and even other organisms. So all of these components, they will consist of a system. They will entirely make a system that you will call as ecosystem. So basically ecosystem you can define as the living components and the relationship with the non-living things. So ecosystem will be living organisms and the interactions with the non-living substances. Okay. So in living organisms, you might include various animals, plants, and various insects, and the interactions with the non-living substances. That means soil, air, and all the non-living inanimate object that you see around yourself. So that we define as ecosystem. So for ecosystem to study, you have to study various parameters of ecosystem. Like you have to study the productivity of an ecosystem. What is the productivity? What will be the energy that will be produced in an ecosystem? Second, you have to study about the energy flow. I mean, how the energy will be transferred from the one organism to other organism and so on. So you have to study about the energy flow. Then you have to study about the fixation of the energy into the system. By fixation, what I mean is what proportion of energy will be fixed into an organism and what proportion will be lost. So basically, we'll talk about, I'll give an example of an ecological pyramid. It will be just for you to understand the flow of the energy. So, in an ecological pyramid, at the basic level or the basic trophic level, there will be producers. That will be the primary organism of that ecosystem. It mainly consists of the plants in case of grassland ecosystem, in various phytoplanktons in case of aquatic ecosystem. So these will be producers. Second trophic level will be occupied by primary consumers. So as they will consume the producers in the ecosystem, so they are known as primary consumers. Mainly they are herbivores like us, the humans, or the other animals that totally depends on the plants. So they are primary consumers. Then we'll talk about secondary consumers that will occupy the next trophic level. So this is secondary consumer. They are generally carnivores who eat the herbivores or the primary consumers. So producers will be consumed by primary consumers. Primary consumers, they will be consumed by secondary consumers. And the top trophic level will be occupied by decomposers or the tertiary consumers, you can say. So it will be occupied by decomposers. Okay, so the decomposers are generally microorganisms that you see around that you cannot see, but they are the decomposers. You have to use microscope in order to visualize them. So decomposers, they will decompose. And by decompose, you mean that the organic material present in the secondary consumer will be converted and will be released into the atmosphere by the decomposers. So this process is known as decomposition. Okay. So these were different trophic levels. It was just an example how the energy flows between different trophic levels in an ecosystem. So as I said, from the producers it will be transferred to the primary consumers, to the secondary consumers, and the decomposers. So various types of ecological pyramids you can see in the ecosystem. This was an example, typical example of a ecological pyramid that you see in a grassland ecosystem. Okay, so we'll talk about different types of ecosystem. Before that, I would like to say that to study the ecosystem, we have to study different parameters. Like, we have to talk about the productivity of the ecosystem, then the energy flow of the ecosystem, and the net fixation rate or release of the nutrients into the atmosphere. So different ecosystems have different types of productivity. For example, the productivity of plants will be higher in grassland ecosystem. So when the energy from the producers will be transferred to the primary consumers, some energy will be lost, as in the form of heat or due to respiration. As we have studied respiration, heat or energy loss. So some energy will be lost in the form of heat, and the energy that is received by the primary consumers, it will give you an idea of how much the ecosystem is efficient into accumulating the energy or fixing the energy into the living components. So for example, plants are the primary consumers. We talk about an grassland ecosystem. So plants are the primary consumers. They will use the sunlight, and by the process of photosynthesis they will fix the energy into them. So they will acquire organic matters into them. So that will be the productivity, primary productivity. Now, the primary consumers, that depends on these plants. So they generally consume these plants. So primary consumers, they will use the plants as the source of their food. So meanwhile, the process of this energy flow, some energy will be lost due to respiration, as in the form of heat. So respiration will be the cause of the loss of the energy during this energy flow. So you cannot say that the 100% energy that was produced by the plants, that will be transferred into the primary consumers. Let's say that 10% of the energy is 90% of the energy is lost due to respiration. So only the 10% of the net energy that was produced by the plants is only flowed into the primary consumers. So now, from these primary consumers, the energy will be flown into the secondary consumers, as they will consume the primary consumers. So let's say that again some energy will be lost, as in the form of respiration. So 90% will be lost. Okay, and again 10% of the 10%, that means 1% of the energy is transferred into the secondary consumers. So you have noticed one thing, that not all the energy is always transferred to the next trophic level or to the organism that is consuming the original organism. So what do you understand by this is that the energy that is lost in the form of respiration will be the cause of the net primary productivity. So net primary productivity will be dependent on this respiration and the primary productivity. Okay, so primary productivity is the amount of energy that is produced by the plants, that means the producers. So net primary productivity will be primary productivity, that means gross primary production, that will be known as gross primary production, minus the energy that is lost due to respiration. I have explained what is NPP, GPP and R. R is the energy that is lost due to respiration. Gross primary productivity is the energy that is produced by the plants, and the net primary productivity is the net ratio that will be transferred to the next trophic level. So this way we can calculate NPP. Generally 90% of the energy is lost and 10% of the energy is transferred to the next trophic level. So now we have talked about the ecological pyramids. We have talked about different trophic levels. Now we'll talk about the food chain and food web. Food chain and food web. We have talked about productivity. We have talked about energy flow. Okay, and now we'll talk about how the energy is flowed between different species in an ecosystem, and it forms a kind of chain or a web, you can say. So food chain is a chain that is formed by different relations of different species in an ecosystem, where one species will be dependent on other, as we have seen that the primary consumers that will be dependent on producers, secondary consumers that will be dependent on primary consumers, and the decomposers will be dependent on the below trophic level secondary consumers. So food chain is defined as the net okay, so food chain is defined as the net energy transfer system from one group or species to other species in an ecosystem. Okay, I'll give a typical example of a food chain where, let's say that plants or grass, let's take an example of grass. They are the primary producers. So they will be consumed by the herbivores. Let's say the herbivores is squirrel. Okay, it's dependent on grass, let's say. So it will be eating the grass. Squirrel will be eaten by the primary consumers. Sorry, it is the primary consumer. It will be consumed by the secondary consumers. So let's say squirrel is eaten by snake. A snake is a secondary consumer that will depend on a squirrel, which will ultimately be consumed by, let's say, higher consumers. Let's say a lion. And then the lion will be decomposed by the bacteria when it is dead. When it dies, it will be decomposed by bacteria. So you see, this is a kind of chain where one organism is related to other, and the other is to one more, and so on. So it forms a kind of chain where one organism will depend on the other organism for the food, for the energy. So this is the food chain. This is known as the food chain. So different kind of food chains can be observed in a single ecosystem. Like if we talk about here in this food chain, it's not necessary that the grass will only be consumed by the squirrel. Grass can also be consumed by some other herbivores, like you can say let's say some other herbivore, deer. Okay, deer can also be eaten by lion. Okay, it's not necessary that the squirrel can only be eaten by a snake. Squirrel can also be eaten by you can say some other carnivore. Let's for example tiger, which can also be decomposed by bacteria. So this way it's not necessary like snake will be eaten by heathen, that will be decomposed by bacteria. Grass will be eaten by insects. Insects will be consumed by a mouse. Mouse will be eaten by heathen. A mouse can also be eaten by snake. A mouse can also be eaten by lion, or a mouse can directly be decomposed by bacteria if it is found dead in the ecosystem. So this way, in a single ecosystem, multiple food chains can be interrelated and they form a kind of web. You can see it's very complex. So they form a kind of web. So you can call that when more than one food chains are interrelated in a single ecosystem, so they will form a kind of complex structure for the energy flow that will be known as the food web. Okay, so in food web there might be more than 2, 3 or 4 or might be more than that food chains. Okay, so this way the food chain and the food web, they are found in every single ecosystem that you see around yourself. We haven't talked about the type of the ecosystem around us. So if we talk about the types of the ecosystem, you see various kind of ecosystems around you, like you will see grassland ecosystem, the ecosystem that we live in. You see, if you will see around yourself, so the system that we live in will be covered, or where the primary producers are generally grass. Okay, or if you talk about a forest, so that will be a grassland ecosystem. If you talk about an open ocean, then it will be an aquatic ecosystem. If you talk about a cave where there no sunlight enters, so there will be always a period that is occupied by darkness. So this type of ecosystem will be known as detritus ecosystem. So there are various kind of ecosystems. So grassland ecosystem, aquatic ecosystems, and